There are stories that do not end even after death, and this one begins with a scent that no one has forgotten. Everything seemed to follow the protocol. Cold lights, heavy silence, and fixed stares at the condemned. The countdown echoed inside each person present, as if time had lost its rhythm. And then, absolute silence. The moment of the last breath had arrived. But what no one expected was that at the exact moment of execution, the air was filled with a smell. A sweet, almost floral perfume, subtle yet striking, that seemed to appear out of nowhere and envelop everything. Guards exchanged glances. The chaplain stepped back slightly. A juror whispered, "Did you feel that too?" What should have been the end became the beginning of something that still challenges logic today. A deadly secret seemed to have been released in that moment, and this scent, which invaded the space like an invisible whisper, was not just any aroma. It was exactly the same one described by the victim days before dying. An almost forgotten detail in the process, hidden among testimonies and technical analyses. Her detail that for many was nothing more than a coincidence. But what if it isn't? What if the body that had just been executed was not the true culprit? Stay with me until the end, because what you are about to discover may deeply surprise you. In cases like this, where science cannot grasp the explanation, reports become beacons for a truth that many prefer to ignore. And here, in this video, we will dive not only into the crime, but into the psychological and emotional effects that certain phenomena provoke in those who witness them. Have you ever experienced a situation you couldn't explain? A déjà vu? A premonition, a scent that made you stop everything? That's what we're talking about. But this time the setting is not a quiet room or a childhood memory. It's an execution chamber. It's the end of a life, and the beginning of a mystery. Experts in criminology and criminal psychology have tried to understand events like this. Some speak of collective hallucination, environmental suggestion, or even the release of hormones and olfactory memories under extreme emotional pressure. But when the same perfume is mentioned by the victim, sensed by the condemned, and perceived by several people around, doubt transforms into astonishment. Because perhaps the silence of the innocents is not merely symbolic. Perhaps it has smell, texture, and presence. The human mind tends to ignore what challenges what is considered real. But what if that smell is exactly that? The last attempt at communication from a soul that has never been heard. What to do when the system closes a case, but the signs keep appearing? And what if what we call justice actually conceals an irreversible mistake? It is at this point that the story ceases to be just a narrative and transforms into an invitation. A call to reopen not just a case, but a much deeper debate about truth, perception, and the limits of human understanding. And it all starts at that moment when a perfume emerges in the air. It may seem small, a smell, a whisper, a sensation. But sometimes it is precisely in that detail that the truth resides, which the whole world has decided to ignore. And when reason tries to silence what we feel, that is when we need to listen more deeply. And that's why I want to invite you to be part of this genuine conversation. If this topic makes sense to you, leave a comment about what has touched you so far. Have you ever lived something similar? Have you ever felt something you couldn't explain but seemed too real to ignore? Your experience, your perspective, your doubt, all of that has value. It is what transforms this space into something alive, into a community where we not only watch but share, question, and grow together. Like this video, if in some way it made you think differently, this helps more than you can imagine in sharing this content with others who may also be seeking answers. And if you want to continue diving into stories like this, which mix mind, mystery, and humanity, subscribe to the channel. It's that simple gesture that allows us to continue producing with depth, responsibility, and connection. Because every person who comes here, every click, every comment, is like a candle lit in a dark room. It illuminates a little more the path we still have ahead. And speaking of path, what comes next goes even deeper. Because this was not the only strange sign that appeared after the execution, but a cold, cruel murder, the kind that shocks even the most experienced investigators. The body of a woman was found at home, signs of a struggle, marks on her neck, a striking perfume still lingering in the air. No witnesses, no cameras, just an anonymous call that alerted the police. Days later, a man was arrested. Ex-partner. A history of instability, a troubled emotional background done, the culprit was chosen. But were they really looking at the right person? During the trial, something didn't fit. Contradictory testimonies, timelines that didn't match, circumstantial evidence supported more by narrative than by solid proof. But society wanted quick answers, a defined culprit, a resolution to relieve collective tension. And when pressure becomes greater than the search for truth, dangerous decisions occur. That is where the risk lies. When the thirst for justice tramples caution, the suspect denied everything, always, from the interrogation to the final sentence. He said he was elsewhere, mentioned people who could confirm that, but no one was heard. Documents went missing, witnesses changed their stories, and slowly but surely the case was being molded to fit a convenient solution. Justice, often, does not walk alongside truth, but rather practicality. And the hidden truth remains there in silence, waiting for someone willing to listen to what hasn't been said. This case never truly closed. It was wrapped up on paper, but it never healed between the lines. And that's where the psychological impact becomes devastating. Because when there is doubt, there is torment. And that torment does not only affect the condemned, it spreads like a fog in the background of the investigation, in the minds of jurors, in the hearts of family members, and even among those who believed they did the right thing. What bothers us most about this type of story is not just what we know, but what we choose to ignore. And when the smell of perfume appears years later, at the exact moment of execution, it is not just a coincidence, it is a reminder, a sort of invisible mark of what was left behind, a subtle revelation that something was unresolved, that perhaps everything has been interpreted the wrong way. Such occurrences force us to rethink our certainties. They change our way of seeing decisions, transform our mentality, and expand how we deal with what is real and what we cannot explain. And when doubt settles in, fear disguises itself as conviction, just so no one notices that everything might have been a great mistake. Comment below, I feel like something is unresolved. I want to know if you also perceive this emptiness. That seems to echo in every detail of this case. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because what initially seemed just another peculiarity of the case turned out to be one of the most unsettling elements of this journey. The victim wore a striking perfume, a sweet, slightly floral aroma, but with a woody base that lingered in memory. This was mentioned in the case files almost as an irrelevant detail, just an observation about the bottle found on the vanity. But after her death, this very perfume began to appear in situations where it should never have been. During the first weeks of the investigation, 2 police officers reported smelling the scent in the interrogation room without any explanation. At first, they thought it was some remnant brought by visitors, or even from the environment itself. But that space had been isolated, cleaned, sealed, and none of those present wore any fragrance. Days later, this same aroma was sensed by an assistant to the prosecutor during the review of files. The detail is that when she opened a specific folder with photos of the victim, she felt the same olfactory note, intense enough to make her stop what she was doing. It was not a collective hallucination, nor psychological suggestion induced by panic. These were isolated, spontaneous reports, with implications almost always ignored. After all, how to take seriously information based on a smell? But the records lingered in the background of the case like shadows refusing to disappear, and what seemed impossible gained a new layer of impact when, during the final verdict, one of the jurors confessed to smelling the same perfume in the room. At the exact moment when the judge read the sentence, she did not tell anyone at the time. She kept it to herself. It was only revealed later when the case had already been closed, during a confidential interview with a criminal psychologist. The explanation? None. Just a huge discomfort, as if something during that trial had slipped through the cracks. An unease that grew over time, as if the perfume had left not only a trace in the air, but a scar on her conscience. These episodes shake our structure because they make us confront what is beyond what we can prove. They challenge our mindset, our belief in what is rational, and provoke a silent transformation. Because deep down we all fear what we cannot name, and when signs like these appear, repetitive, intense, unsettling, it's hard not to wonder if we are really hearing everything we should. Perhaps this smell was never just a detail. Perhaps it is the key that links all the points that no one had the courage to connect. A kind of disguised revelation that only appears to those who are still attentive to subtle signs. And that's why this seemingly trivial detail has become the most intriguing element of the entire narrative. Write in the comments, some signs cannot be ignored. I want to know if this gives you the same chills too. Because when we dive into the invisible layers of this story, we begin to notice that the greatest noise isn't in the testimonies, the evidence, or the official records. It's in the silence. The silence that hangs in the background of the trial, in the downcast looks of the investigators, in the restrained gestures of the family members, and even in the rigid posture of the jurors after the verdict. It is in this unspoken space that something even more powerful than the crime itself hides: the weight of doubt. The human mind has complex mechanisms when it needs to deal with something that doesn't fit, and when there is the slightest possibility that a decision might have been wrong, especially a definitive one like a death sentence, this discomfort slowly settles in. Not as a direct accusation, but as an unease that takes shape in the details. A memory that insists on returning. A scent that appears out of nowhere. A recurring dream with the same scene. This is where the psychology of regret comes into play. A silent phenomenon, often denied, but that eats away from within. Investigators who participated in the case reported years later that certain elements didn't match up, but it was easier to go with the flow of the process than to confront the system. Jurors who could never sleep the same way again. Victims' relatives who, instead of finding peace, felt an even greater void after the execution. And the family of the condemned, who carry a double burden, that of loss and impotence in the face of a possible injustice. All of this shapes an emotional journey where the hidden truth screams for recognition. Even if no one has the courage to face it directly, the disturbed mind doesn't just suffer, it tries to make sense of the suffering. And it is in this effort to understand that signs emerge. Perhaps they stem from trauma, as many assert, but maybe, just maybe, they are real, only ignored by those not ready to see. After all, not everyone can hear what isn't said, feel what isn't touched, perceive what hides behind cold, rational decisions. There is a sensitivity that transcends the obvious, and when this sensitivity is blocked, regret finds other ways to manifest. The big question is, are we prepared to recognize these signs as part of the truth, or do we prefer the comfort of simple explanations, even if they are filled with gaps? This reflection, no matter how uncomfortable it may be, can be the starting point for a profound transformation, not just of the case itself, but of how we choose to deal with the consequences of our decisions. Write in the comments, "The truth weighs in silence." I want to see who else feels that behind this story, there is something that is still trying to be revealed. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because to understand what really happened, it's impossible to ignore who was at the center of this story. The man who was condemned, executed, and to this day divides opinions between those who saw him as innocent and those who believe it, was all just a meticulously constructed theater. He was discreet, not exactly cold, but distant. The type of person who speaks little, observes a lot, and rarely reveals what he is thinking. He had an education above average for someone of his background, an articulate vocabulary, and a way of expressing himself that unsettled the more skeptical, because he didn't react as if he were in despair, even knowing he could face the death penalty. That alone raised suspicions. Some saw him as calculating. Others saw him as simply in shock in front of a situation he couldn't control. But what really changed the perception of many was the discovery of a diary, a notebook filled with notes that seemed more like daydreams than confessions. Among disconnected thoughts were enigmatic snippets about death, forgiveness, energy, and what he referred to as signs from beyond. On one page he wrote, "Not everything ends when they say it did. What is true returns." What did that mean? A warning? An attempt to appear mystical? Or just the reflection of someone who no longer knew how to communicate with the world around him? These notes were used by both sides in the trial. The prosecution tried to paint him as manipulative, someone who wanted to appear profound and wronged to elicit empathy from the jury. The defense argued that it revealed a sensitive man disturbed by the accusations, trying to find meaning where there was only pain. And between these two extremes lay the emptiness of doubt, fueled by fragments of a past that was never fully clarified. There were gaps in his history, abrupt changes of city, jobs that didn't last, short relationships. Nothing exactly criminal, but enough for some to perceive a pattern of escape. Others said he was merely someone hurt by life, trying to restart every time the past knocked at his door. And in this game of perceptions, the truth lay buried beneath interpretations, assumptions, and fears. The most intriguing point of all this is that even in the face of death, he never begged, never protested dramatically. He simply stared at the glass in the room, took a deep breath, and said, "You will remember me by what you feel afterwards." An ambiguous, unsettling phrase, a possible warning, or just a final attempt to leave a mark. Write in the comments, "Not everything is what it seems." I want to see who else feels that this case goes far beyond what was shown in the records, because there is something in silence that sometimes screams louder than any argument. During the years he spent in prison, he spoke the bare minimum. He responded politely, but always in a restrained manner, almost as if he weighed every word before releasing it into the world. There were no confessions or revolts, no attempts to justify his story with long speeches or emotional declarations. And this to many was unsettling, because in a system where every condemned person seems to fight desperately for a chance to be heard, he chose the opposite path, that of absolute silence. This behavior created an air of mystery that transcended the walls of the penitentiary. The very guards, accustomed to dealing with all kinds of people, said there was something different about that man. A gaze that was neither cold nor regretful. It was distant, as if he were physically present, but his mind was always elsewhere. Some reported that he spent hours staring at the ceiling of his cell, as if waiting for something. Others said they saw him writing and then tearing up what he had written. Small gestures, but together they created the sensation that there was an entire universe inside him, locked away and inaccessible. And what marked the most was the final moment. Facing the chance to say his last words, he merely shook his head, refusing. Nothing. No phrase, no plea, no forgiveness. The execution was silent, until the moment the scent appeared in the air. The combination of that smell and the absolute silence created an atmosphere that no one there would forget. Some interpreted it as a challenge, others as a final plea for justice. But the truth is that when someone chooses not to say anything until the end, they are either hiding something or have already said everything they needed with their silence. This kind of attitude leaves deep traces, because silence, when it comes with intention, becomes a message, and the impact of this reaches those who remain, who observe, who need to find meaning where there seemingly is no explanation. Perhaps he chose not to speak because he knew no one was truly willing to listen. Or perhaps he did it so that the silence itself could become eternal, echoing longer than any word could. In times when everything is noise, this decision transforms the absence of speech into one of the most powerful forms of expression. The most disturbing thought is that he may have taken a secret with him, something that, if revealed, would change everything, a detail that slipped away, a hidden truth that never found the space to come to light. And it is at this point in the journey that we begin to question not only what was said, but, more importantly, what was avoided by him and by everyone around. Comment: silence speaks too. I want to see who else feels that in this story. What was not said is just as important as everything that has been exposed so far. Because when a phenomenon happens once, it can be classified as coincidence, but when it repeats, in different places, with different people, and in similar contexts, It's no longer coincidence, it's a pattern. And that's exactly what started to intrigue the few specialists brave enough to look beyond the traditional reports. After the execution of that man and the scent that marked his last breath, similar reports emerged in other prisons across the country. In each of them, what seemed improbable began to become an unsettling constant. In a penitentiary in the South, 2 officers reported smelling a similar aroma just after the execution of another condemned man. Neither of them was wearing perfume that day, and the environment had been isolated hours earlier. In the Midwest, a nursing staff member left the injection room crying, saying she had heard a voice whispering her name seconds before the application. She never returned to work. And in the North, there was even a report of a crucifix that rotated by itself, affixed to the concrete wall, while the prisoner was led to death row. These stories spread discreetly, like whispers in the background of the prison system. No one wanted to speak officially, but everyone wanted to understand what was happening. For many, all of this is a result of extreme tension, a charged environment, vulnerable minds, bodies on high alert. And it's not a lie. Stress can provoke hallucinations, distortions of perception, unexpected psychological reactions. But there is a difference between an isolated delusion and multiple accounts with the same details, the same type of smell, the same sensation of presence, the same signs that insist on appearing when life is about to cease. Are we facing something that challenges our current understanding? Or do we prefer not to recognize these patterns because they call our entire logic into question? Forensic psychologists, criminologists, and even human behavior scholars outside traditional fields have begun to pay closer attention to these reports, some with skepticism, others with fascination. And in this process, a bold hypothesis emerged: that consciousness in its final moments may leave traces, sensory, emotional, energetic, that impact the surrounding environment. It is still an idea surrounded by doubts and gaps, but it raises a powerful question: what really remains after death? This type of investigation requires more than technique. It requires sensitivity, because it touches on something that goes beyond biology, beyond justice, beyond easy explanations. We are talking about a dimension where trauma, regret, and perhaps even hidden truths intertwine. And what is emerging now may just be the beginning of a greater revelation, something that, for now, can only be perceived by those who are willing to listen to what is unsaid, to feel what cannot be measured. Write in the comments. There's something here that we still don't understand. So I want to see who else is starting to realize that this story goes far beyond what it seems. Now I want to dive even deeper into this subject. Because when even science, with all its methods and attempts at control, is faced with the inexplicable, something within us changes. And it's not just a matter of understanding with reason, it's about feeling with what we cannot name. After reports began to repeat in different institutions, specialists in psychology, neuroscience, and psychiatry started investigating the phenomenon. The goal was clear: to understand, measure, classify. But what they found was something that slipped through their fingers, as if refusing to fit into ready-made formulas. Some suggested that it was merely olfactory suggestion, a type of illusion caused by emotional association, where the brain, under intense stress, would recreate sensations based on unconscious memories or expectations. Others bet on the idea of collective trauma, where the charged atmosphere of an execution could awaken distorted perceptions in more than one person simultaneously. There were also those who pointed to episodes of induced hallucination, resulting from adrenaline, fear, or previous experiences that had left psychic traces. However, in practice, none of these hypotheses held firm. No study was able to simulate the same conditions and achieve the same result. No experiment could reproduce that specific smell at the exact moment everything was happening. And even documented accounts with dates, witnesses, and coinciding details were set aside for an uncomfortable reason: they simply did not fit into any model recognized by current science. The truth is that in the face of this type of situation, science, which gives us so many answers, also finds its own limits, and when it falls silent, the mystery speaks louder. But that doesn't mean there is no value in this investigation. On the contrary, science, when it is true, is not afraid to say we still don't know. And it is in this space of the unknown that the greatest opportunities for transformation arise, because it is there, where data is lacking, that listening prevails, and where explanation is missing, the possibility of revelation is born. Perhaps we are not only dealing with human reactions, but with some type of record, as if certain experiences left marks in time and space, ready to reappear before those who are sensitive enough to notice. This border between the rational and the intuitive, between what is measurable and what is only felt, is where the true complexity of the human mind resides. And perhaps on this journey, what matters most is not proving, but recognizing. Because admitting that something eludes us is the first step to looking more deeply, not only at phenomena but at ourselves. Write in the comments, not everything needs to fit within logic. I want to know who else believes that sometimes what we feel is truer than what can be explained. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when everything seems to have been said, recorded and closed, it is precisely there that the invisible voices begin to make themselves heard. The execution happened, the sentence was carried out, and justice, at least on paper, was done. But for the family of that man, the end never truly arrived. They tried to reopen the case, gathered documents, sought new analyses, insisted on every detail that had been ignored in the trial. But all they found was a cold wall of institutional silence. For society, this chapter needed to be closed as soon as possible. Disturbing this story would be far too uncomfortable. Admitting the possibility of error is a wound that few are willing to poke. Yet while everyone tries to move on, something remains, like a dissonant note in the midst of an overly rehearsed melody. And if this scent that insists on reappearing in the most unlikely moments with different witnesses in separate contexts was precisely the attempt to keep this case alive, not for sensationalism, but for justice. Perhaps this is the language that remained for those who were never truly heard, because sometimes the truth does not shout, it whispers, and only those who have learned to perceive what lies between the lines of reality can hear it. The feeling of injustice has a weight that does not dissolve with time. It transforms. It becomes search, vigil, unrest. Those who remain try to find answers even when they know that the system has already turned the page. But some stories refuse to die because they carry something that still pulses, a hidden truth that continues to send signals, waiting for someone who not only sees, but recognizes. This is not just a fight for a new trial. It is a battle for meaning, for validating that there is something beyond what was formally documented, and it is at this point that a profound reflection on what we call justice arises. Is it limited to what is written in a sentence? Or in certain situations, does justice occur when we finally see what we have tried to deny for so long? Sometimes the signs do not come to haunt, they come to awaken. They do not want to frighten. They want to remind. And each time this scent reappears, it is as if the past reaches out to the present and says, "It is not over yet." This story goes beyond a specific case. It invites us to rethink our certainties, to question how willing we are to listen to those who no longer have a voice. Because if silence has already said everything it could, perhaps now it is our turn to listen more attentively. Comment below. Some stories do not know how to rest. I want to see who else feels that certain truths simply refuse to be forgotten. Because when something insists on returning, even after everything seems resolved, it is a sign that there is still an unanswered question. The appearance of that scent may seem like a detail, but within this story it represents something greater. It appears as someone who refuses to be forgotten, like a trace of memory that refuses to disappear. And if, at its core, this smell is not merely an isolated phenomenon but a symbol, a reminder that behind every archived case there are voices that no one wanted to hear. And if, in that last moment, what spread through the air was not just a fragrance but a presence, a condensed energy of everything that was trapped, from pain, from injustice, from the truth that was never given space. We are not talking merely about a condemned man. We are talking about an absence of listening, about a chain of decisions that prioritized closure over understanding. And the perfume perhaps is the subtlest, and at the same time the most profound way of saying the story is still alive. The idea may seem uncomfortable, but we can no longer ignore it. What if that smell was a final cry? Not from a guilty person trying to appear as a victim, but from someone who never even had the real right to explain themselves. At many points in life, we are led to believe that everything must have an objective answer. But the truth is that there are things that escape logic and yet touch us deeply. Science may not be able to measure them. Courts may not want to admit them. But those who witness this type of phenomenon know that something is there. Something that asks to be recognized even if silently. And the most unsettling part of all is that perhaps this truth will never come to light in a formal way. Perhaps it will never be printed in a report or read by a judge, but it leaves traces. In the reports that repeat, in the details that do not fade, in the glances that still avoid talking about the case, there is a hidden truth that reveals itself in the cracks, in the backgrounds, in the small breaks of normalcy. And each of these elements points to something larger, deeper, more human than any document can reach. Justice, when it is real, does not settle for hasty closures. It seeks meaning. And sometimes that meaning reveals itself in unexpected ways. The smell, in this case, may have been all that remained of a life that couldn't prove its innocence. But even so, it left an impact. A signal that compels us to look closer, to reflect, to feel. Because some truths cannot be explained, but are recognized. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this content touched a point within you. And that's why I want to thank you for staying until the end of this journey. Because this kind of reflection only makes sense when shared with those who truly allow themselves to feel. If this video brought you new perspectives or sparked a question you're still trying to understand, leave your comment with the phrase, "This message was for me." It will be nice to know who was with me until now. If you felt that connection, give it a like, not just because it helps the video, but because it shows me that it's worth continuing to bring stories that stir the mind and go beyond it. And if this type of content makes sense to you, subscribe to the channel. This allows me to keep bringing themes that often remain hidden between the lines of what we call reality. I have a playlist for you to see other cases, but if you're curious about the secret locked in a cell, I suggest watching this other video. Click and stay with me over there. The conversation isn't over yet.